Hi, this is Marina from frocksandfrolics.com, and in this video I'm going to show you how to work the long sleeve for the Western blouse. It's recently had an update, goes now from 9 to 12 months all the way up to 12 years. I hope you really enjoyed this. Let's get started. For the cuff on the Western blouse, you will need the cuff 4 times and 2 times in interfacing, and we want to use iron-on interfacing because that's easiest. Now on the sleeve you have marked where you have the opening, the slit here, and you can work that slit two different ways. You can either put a placket on there and work it like a boy's cuff or a gentleman's cuff, and there's a video for that which I did for the boys shirt, so you can watch that for this one. I've also got two little pleats in there, but in this case I'm gonna do that gathered. And then for the bias binding, I'm doing it without cutting it on the bias, and it makes it a lot easier because I have got a stripe, and stripes are always easy to work with. So here you can see why I need the double length, and we're going to just sew that on. But before we do, what we need to do is iron our bias binding lengthways in half first, and then we're going to iron each of the sides towards the middle, but you don't want to iron it so that the rough edge sits exactly in that iron crease. You actually want to iron it so that it's a little bit off the center, so that when we iron both the folded over edges together, that we then can have one slightly shorter than the other, and the wider one will sit on the underside, so that when we're top stitching we're absolutely catching it. And then we're just going to put the bias binding on one side, and what we're going to do is to sew one side of the bias binding here to that sleeve opening first. And what that will do is it will just help me that at the tip where we want to grab only a tiny bit, that it can't slip out, which easily happens, right? So open it out here, and I'm going to just put a pin here where the tip is. So whereas the seam allowances or edges are on top of each other at the beginning, it runs into the tip where we're only catching a couple of millimeters, maybe even just a millimeter. So you just catch it. The less you catch, the better it will look afterwards. And then on the other side, it runs back into the full seam allowance. So I'm going to pin this for you so we can demonstrate that. Right, so we're going over to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch this in first, and then we're going to do another stitching line over the top and just top stitch it down. And the important thing is that then the top edge is the one that is a slightly shorter one. So that's the only thing to remember when you put it on. The longer one is the one we're stitching on first. Big stitch length, and longest you have, and then I'm going to just pop that on here. Now I've actually taken my pin back out because I'm better without pins, but of course you don't have to take the pins back out like I do. With a needle in the fabric, turn and then go to the end. And now that that's securely in, the next step is now to fold over the bias binding and to top stitch it. And because the underside is slightly wider, we will definitely catch it. So I'm going to do that all the way to the end. I hold it really taut with my right hand, and my left hand can move the fabric to and fro. Move it around here where you have the tip. Secure your stitches, and it's in. It's really nice. It's coated. Of course you want to check that, and then you can remove the basting stitch. Just pull it out. Great. Alrighty, that worked really well. Now I can go and iron that really well so it's nice and flat. Now we need to secure this bias binding. So this is now the outside showing, and we want to tuck the bias to the inside, right? So that it then sits on top of each other later like that. That also means that one is folded over. It's a very good idea to give that a press in a minute. But for now, what we're going to do is just sew across that edge here. It's a little triangle, and that will make sure that it sits really well and it doesn't work its way out. And now you can put in your pleats, or you can do what I did to make it a bit more girly. I'm going to gather it. So we only have a very little bit there to gather, and you can lock in your stitches at the top if you like. They will still pull out really easy because you're using such a big stitch length. So we're doing one line of stitching, and then we do another line of stitching next to that, and you only need to do that for about 10 centimeters because actually there isn't much to gather. And the next step now is to iron on the interfacing. And we want to make sure that we iron the interfacing onto the underside of your cuff. And you've got 4 cuffs exactly the same, unless of course you have a contrast cuff. Then make sure that whatever is the fabric that faces the outside is the one that gets the interfacing on it. And if you have, interfacing that sticks to the iron, it can happen. Then give it a really good press from the upper side as well. You can do that with steam just to make sure that the interfacing doesn't come off. And you can see here that I've put some lace into the front placket, and I'm going to do the same on the cuff. And because there isn't much of it left, what I did was I cut straight through it. So I have 2 of these, one for each cuff, but it's not wide enough for the seam allowance. So I need to make sure, of course, that the right side is facing down now as I put that onto the cuff with the interfacing, and I make sure that I allow for the seam allowance. So I place it so it's just within that. So pretty sharpish actually. And then when you come around to curve, it's really important that you put a pleat in there. Otherwise, it's tight when you turn it and it won't look very nice. So you need to have a little bit of extra lace there as you work your way around to that side and back down. And how did I learn that? Of course, I did it wrong the first time, had to unpick it. So it happens to the best of us. I really didn't think about that. And so you must make sure that you do that. You need that little bit extra. I stick to my seam allowance of 1 centimeter, and of course I make sure that I catch a little bit of the lace. I literally caught like 2.5 millimeters, so like very, very little. But it was the lace I wanted, and I think it's really cute. So had I had more lace, I probably would have allowed for the centimeter seam allowance. That would have made my life a little bit easier. And here you can see me struggling to put a pleat in. So some of you might want to pin that actually, and pin that pleat as you work your way around. Or you could even baste it first. If you're unsure that you can get that right just by fiddling it. I think beginners probably should do that. Again, it was really nice to have a stripe because I could line up the stripe along the long edge here. That was really cool with the lines of the stripe, obviously, and made my life really easy. And you can see here, struggle again to put like a pleat in, but that pleat's ever so important. We'll have a look at it in a minute and you shall see. There you go. Successful pleat done. I'll move my way around, stitch by stitch. In fact, I think I put another slight pleat in there so that there definitely is enough room. Go to the end. Right, so when I move this out now, you can see that it needs all of what I put in there, right? That pleat's so important, just for that little bit of room. Now, the next step is to just put the second part of the cuff, which doesn't have the interfacing on it, underneath it. And then we're going to stitch exactly on the same line all the way around again. Now, this is only one way to do a cuff. There's actually quite a lot of them.
the reason I chose this method here is because I have got lace in there, and it's much simpler for me at least to fiddle a little bit afterwards with the lace where we are attaching it to the sleeve than to use any of the other methods. And when you purchase the Western blouse and you do it, you will see that in the ebook you've got two separate instructions for different ways to work the cuff. Now we're going to cut this back pretty sharpish. Then we're going to work out all the edges, give it a very good press, lots of steam, and we're ready for the sleeve. Now the sleeve is also a puff sleeve, and so we need to put gather threads in the top edge of the sleeve head, and we're doing one line close to the edge and then another 1 foot width next to that. And you need the longest stitch length that you've got on your sewing machine. That's real important. Leave a long thread hanging. There comes the next one. Foot width next to the outer one, and that's it. Now I've already shown you how you can close the side seam first and then you put the sleeve in. Here I thought we'd do it like a boy's shirt because it does make life a little bit easier. You can do it quite quickly. So what you want to do is put the sleeve right sides facing each other on top of the front. Make sure that where you have the snip on your sleeve, that indicates the front is facing the front. And then we put the shoulder and the sleeve head on top of each other. And then we move over to the other side and put the underarm and the sleeve on top of each other as well. So we've got those 3 points pinned, and then we're going to bring the sleeve in flat, the lower edge. So I would put in 2 pins on either side, and then we can start gathering this. Let's start with this side. Pull the gather threads, and what I find best for like these larger sizes for little girls, so this is the age 9, you want to have the gather spread out 3 to 4 centimeters from the shoulder point. So you might measure that. I've got 4 centimeters here. So I need to make sure that when I do the other side, that that's also 4 centimeters from that shoulder point, right? So pull your gather threads. There we go. Now we have 4 centimeters on that side as well. I'm going to measure that in a minute. And also flat at the beginning. Again, it's the length of 2 pins usually. If you have a smaller size, H1 to 2 for example, you'll only want 3 centimeters or 2.5 to either side. Of course, that changes with the size of your blouse. And it's always a good idea to have a quick check what it actually looks like from the outside, so you can roll it over your hand a little bit and check that your sleeve looks really good. And again, also make sure that, you know, the opening is towards the back. Then you know you've put the sleeve in right. And that looks good to me. Very nice. So that's 4 centimeters to either side, 8 centimeters altogether that you have gathers. And then I put this in with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Make sure that nothing folds over underneath it. That's really important to know. So make sure it's nice and flat. And then you can arrange your gathers a little bit nicer with a pin as you go over. And I always do that at that point because you have most control, because the left hand holds the whole thing a little bit taut and the right hand, of course, you have the pin and you can adjust them a little bit so that they look really good. And we go all the way to the end. Beautiful. Lock in your stitches, and then we can go straight over to the serger or overlocker. And what we want to do is have the sleeve side actually underneath it, because your overlocker has or serger has like a really pretty side when it serges and an underside. You always want to serge from the side that is going to be visible, right? And in that case, that's of course the top of the blouse, right, rather than the sleeve. Now, it doesn't really matter too much. I mean, who's going to look at it? This is something that I like to do because I like it to look really great. And the next thing is the ironing. What you don't want to do is iron from the outside or iron any of the seams over to one side. All you do is iron the seam flat. And that will make sure that it still can roll towards the outside really nice and gives you that rounded effect. So now we've done that, if we look again, you can see how this still rounds when the seam allowance stands into the sleeve. The last thing you want is to have that all sitting really flat. I'm going to take out my gather threads there as well, I think, just to make it really neat. And now I'm closing the side seam and the underarm seam in one go. You want to make sure that the sleeve seams here are exactly on top of each other. Put a pin in there, vertical to the seam, and then put a pin on the start of the where the hem is, and then also put pins in the sleeve, and then we're going to close the whole lot in one go. And that's how most shirts are made, really, and it's quite a nice way of doing it. Of course, if you're making a very small garment as well, this makes good sense as well. The smaller the size, the easier you want to make it for yourself. And this works really well. So the seam allowance here again, as always, people always ask me, what's your seam allowance? And it's 1 centimeter. So I come up here. Now I can take out the pin, turn a little, and go all the way to the end. And again, of course, while we're there, we can just pop straight over to the serger and we can serge this edge. And again, what you want to do is have the front facing up, because we iron the seam always towards the center back. So that means that the nice side will be visible. Again, it's not, you know, a mistake or anything like that when you do it the other way around, and certainly you shouldn't undo anything. This is just like a good habit to get into, and it becomes second nature after a while. Then we iron the seam on the sleeve board here towards the center back. It's nicely steaming up always. And we'll do that here as well, and that's it, really. Beautiful. So now we're ready to put the cuff on, and we want to make sure that this one side is basically folded over from the bias binding. Make absolutely sure that you've done that. And then we're taking our cuff, and where we have the lace sewn on and where we have the interfacing ironed on, that's the side I am now attaching to the cuff, right sides facing. And then I'm going to just put a pin in there. I'll make very sure that the edge sits right on there. And then I go to the other edge, and here my bias binding goes in flat right to the edge. And again, put a pin in vertical to the seam, and then work your way around from that. I'm pulling my gather threads a little bit, and you will see that most of them I had to pull back out because actually it doesn't gather very much at all. But it's quite cute to have these few gathers instead of pleats, because the pleats of course make it look more like a boy's shirt or a very, very cash shirt, which is fine. But since I've put in some lace and I girlified this shirt a little bit, especially since it has stripes, which I really love but it's very easy to then have that look more like a boy's shirt, and that's not what we want. So there you go. Tiny little bit of gather, so I'm going to spread those out nicely as well. And so make sure that the side which has the longer edge of the cuff, that's the edge where you turn in the binding. Very important. And then on the other side it goes in flat, right? So that's what you want to watch. Now I'm going to just pin that on and go and sew it in. Make very sure that there's nothing underneath it. It's so easy to catch something, surely, with this method. This is not the method where you can't catch anything. That's what I show you in the boys' shirt. But here, with the lace, this is the method that works best. At least I think so. So 1 centimeter seam allowance, sew it on from one side to the other. And then we're going right here to the edge. Do not sew into the lace though, just to the edge of your cuff. And then we're going to fiddle that lace in a little bit more. There we go. Now, next step is to remove all your gather threads. Keep it all nice and tidy as you're working. And goodness me, there is a lot of thread there. And then you want to iron the seam into the cuff. Right, put it on your ironing board and give that a really good press. Beautiful. Next, we're going to turn in the lining. And now we're just going to open this out a little bit and then turn it in. And that's why I like doing it like that, because I can now fiddle with the lace a little bit. Yes, you can let it run into the seam as well, but I think this looks actually nicer because it kind of like turns around a bit on that edge. So that's why I like doing this. It's all the tiny little details which make things special, right? And so now I turn in my seam allowance and I pin it to the seam. And you want to make sure that you just cover the seam line, but only just, it needs to lie exactly on it, so that when we then top stitch it from the other side, that it's caught, but also it's not too wide. And again, here I can now fiddle a little bit with my lace to make sure it has this nice little curve that runs round and then into my seam allowance. There we go. Beautiful. One more pin. And then I'm taking it exactly as it is to the sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch it from the outside. When you're sewing from the outside, what you really want to do is make sure that you start on the place which you think is most inconspicuous. And I'm just starting to sew here right in the center of my cuff. Whether or not that's the best place to start, I think it's just a habit for me. I always start there, but you can do it elsewhere as well. And then we work our way around. My stitch length here is stitch length 3. You could also go for stitch length 3.5, and on H12 you could even do 4, because if you have really dinky small stitches, it always looks much more homemade than when you have like nice long stitches for your top stitching. And of course the other thing you could do is just slip stitch it by hand and not top stitch it at all. So that will work if you're doing a very fine silk. You wouldn't want to top stitch that maybe, but then this is for kids, so I would imagine that you're working with some cotton like I am here. Right, and I go all the way around, and I do pull out the pins as I get to them, because where the thread loops over a pin, even if it's in vertical and in theory you can go over it, it might give you a looser stitch there, and that might not look so great. Right, so now we go all the way around. There we go. Needle in your fabric, then turn and come up the other way. There we go. and to the end, lock in your stitches. Beautiful. Right, next we need to put in our buttonholes to this. So what you really need to do is decide where your buttons look best. Find the center of the button and mark that point, and that's usually 1.2, 1.3 centimeters from the edge. And then they should sit like the same distance from either side, you know, so that they're nice and even on there. Then put it in with the buttonhole foot that you've got. I have a manual machine here. It's very much my preferred option to do this, because I'm working forward, I'm putting my pin down exactly where my cross is, and then I can just say, okay, this is how long I want it, and I have more control than I do with an electronic machine. I keep saying this, I think, in every video, but electronic machines have the really nasty habit of when you touch the sensor, it'll stop sewing, and then you have to unpick the buttonhole and do it again. Now, one thing I want to point out is to make very sure that you put your buttonholes on the side where the bias binding is actually turned in, because if you don't, you have to unpick it. And to my shame, I have to say, I went on autopilot, and one of them, I put the buttonholes on the wrong side, which wasn't very funny. But luckily, when I unpicked it, I didn't cut into anything, so the blouse looked absolutely beautiful. So make sure that it's where the bias binding is turned in, that's where you put your buttonholes in. And then you have a beautiful cut. Now all you need to do is decide on the buttons you want to use, and I found some really beautiful metal buttons for this.
Well, thank you very much for watching the long sleeve of the Western blouse, and I hope to see you soon again at Frocks and Frolics or here on YouTube for another project.